Harry and Meghan have basically been operating like it's still 20 years ago, honestly. Like, they genuinely seem to think they're playing by the old rules, where you could control a narrative way easier because the internet wasn't what it is now. Back then, if you wanted to keep something private or spin a story a certain way, you had actual room to do that. The media landscape was slower, more compartmentalized. You'd have different countries reading different publications, and there wasn't this instant way to cross-reference everything you'd ever said. But that's not the world anymore, and they either haven't figured that out or they're refusing to accept it. Meghan especially, and I've said this for a while, she clearly benefited from not being fact-checked when she first entered the public eye. Like, genuinely, people just believed what she said. She had this narrative and it stuck because you couldn't instantly pull up contradictory evidence the way you can now. But that window closed. Now, when she says something, someone's pulling the receipts within hours. There's video, there's old interviews, there's context. People have literally cataloged the inconsistencies and the lies just sit there, visible to anyone who cares to look. The thing that gets me about both of them is they seem to have gotten really comfortable with a certain approach to storytelling. Like, they sit down together, they craft a narrative, and they don't actually go back and check if it lines up with what they've said before or what's provably true. It's like they're failing to check the tape. You know? They're not looking back at their own interviews to see the obvious contradictions staring them in the face. And because of how accessible information is now, that stuff becomes immediately obvious to everyone else. You can't get away with spinning things the way you could when people only had access to whatever their local newspaper decided to print or whatever magazine they happened to read that month. The consensus around them has completely shifted because of this. It used to be this fragmented thing where different people believed different narratives depending on what media they consumed. Now, most people have access to the same information. They can watch Harry and Meghan's own interviews side by side. They can hear them contradict themselves. And because that access exists, the public opinion that's formed is way more unified. People aren't disagreeing about the facts anymore. They're seeing the same facts and reaching the same conclusion, which is that Harry and Meghan lied repeatedly and haven't been honest about their situation. What's wild is that Meghan and Harry are still acting like it's an era where image control was actually possible in the way they're attempting it. Back when Diana was around, back when the internet was new, you could control that narrative more easily. But now, everyone's got the Oprah interview in full. Everyone can watch Netflix and read Spare and cross-reference every claim. Every contradictory statement gets highlighted and shared. The paper trail is so solid now that it's almost comical how easily it is to disprove most of what they're saying. And here's the thing that really bothers people based on what I'm seeing in the reactions. If they actually wanted to fix things with the royal family on a personal level, they need to do it the same way they destroyed it. They went on Oprah, global audience. They did a Netflix documentary that was sensational worldwide. The Spare book became this massive headline story. All of that happened loudly and publicly and shockingly. So if they wanted to make repairs, clear the air, actually correct the record and apologize for the lies, they'd need to do it at that same volume. But they're not going to do that. So people don't really see a path forward where things get fixed because they're not willing to put in the work to undo the damage. The Oprah interview itself is actually a perfect example of how calculated some of this was. The fact that Meghan did the initial part alone, that's not random. She came on by herself, told her story, made claims about Harry's family, and then Harry joined later. Think about why that matters. If you're telling the truth and you want to tell your story together, you sit down together. But Meghan had her one-on-one moment where she could say things without Harry there to contradict her or provide his version or add context or honestly defend himself. Because when you look at what she said in that segment, some of it made Harry look absolutely terrible. She talked about her mental health crisis while pregnant, how serious it got, how she was afraid to be alone. And according to her, she told Harry all of this. He knew how bad it was, and he did nothing. She went to HR about it, and when HR said no, they both just accepted it, like they moved on. That made Harry look completely useless. It made him look like he was either not paying attention to his pregnant wife's severe mental health crisis, or he was paying attention and just didn't care enough to actually do something about it. For a man in his mid to late 30s, that's damning. That's the kind of thing that would require a response. And the fact that Harry wasn't in that segment to respond to it or explain it or push back on it, that's interesting. Because later in the interview, Harry actually contradicted some of what Meghan said. She claimed certain conversations happened while she was pregnant. Harry said those same conversations happened before their wedding. So right there on the Oprah interview itself, you've got provable contradictions. which raises questions about what actually happened versus what's been altered or embellished for the narrative. It really does seem like that was a calculated move on Meghan's part. Keep Harry out of that segment so he can't complicate the story she's telling. So he can't add nuance or context or his own perspective. It gave her space to say things that would reflect badly on him without him being there to push back or defend himself. And the thing is, a lot of people think that's actually pretty strategic and kind of manipulative. You're putting your husband in a position where he either stays silent and lets you make him look bad, or he tries to correct the record and ends up looking like he's contradicting his wife. That's a lose-lose that only works if you've already isolated him from feeling like he can just say no. Which brings up another point that people have been commenting on consistently. Harry allowed his wife to go on camera and talk about his family, to make accusations, to share private family conversations, to paint them in a negative light, and he didn't stop her. He didn't put his foot down beforehand. He didn't say, I don't care how mad I am at them, I'm not letting you do this. Either he was too cowardly to say that, or he didn't have the balls to stand up to her about it. And one of those two options is pretty unflattering, no matter which one it is. Because you're talking about his own family, people he grew up with, people he worked with as an adult. William was his colleague. Catherine was his colleague. King Charles was his father and also his boss. And he just let someone who didn't really have that deep history with them go on international television and weaponize private information against them. That tells people something about Harry that they don't like. The big theory that's been floating around is that Harry had a lot of these toxic traits the whole time, but the palace basically managed them for him. Like they gave him structure. They told him where to be, what to do, they made a fuss over him, he had security, he had importance. All of that made him feel like someone. And people with high narcissism or serious entitlement issues, they actually love that kind of setup. They love being announced. They love feeling important. They love having other people schedule their life and cater to them. The palace essentially soothed whatever toxic behavior Harry might have had because it was all directed toward feeling special and important and cared for. But then Meghan came along and didn't play by those same rules. She didn't accept the guardrails that the palace had in place. She wanted things done differently. She wanted things done her way. And in doing that, she basically gave Harry permission to shed all of those boundaries that had been keeping his worst impulses in check. He didn't need the palace's approval anymore because he had Meghan's. And instead of finding a middle ground or respecting the institution he was part of, he just turned on it. His target became the monarchy itself. What's crazy is that Harry was actually fine as long as he stayed within the basic rules that anyone with a job has to follow. That's not a huge ask. But Meghan came in and she wasn't willing to accept those limitations, and she brought Harry along with her. She didn't just have her own problems with the structure. She actively used Harry's existing grievances and his need to feel important and love to motivate him into action. She gave him a reason to blow it all up. And the thing is, the palace gave them what they said they wanted. Harry wanted out, they let him out. Meghan wanted a different life, they got it. But then it became clear that they didn't actually want what they asked for. They wanted to have it both ways. There's this whole theory about Megxit that people have brought up, and honestly, I think there's something to it. Harry and Meghan wanted half in, half out. They wanted the titles, the prestige, the security, the access to the royal brand, but they didn't want to do the actual work or follow the actual rules. And when the palace said no, like pick a lane, you're either in or you're out, that wasn't the answer they were expecting. They thought the Oprah interview was going to be so shocking, so damaging, so huge that Charles and William would come crawling back, begging them to return. They thought they'd made themselves so essential that the palace would cave. But the palace didn't cave, and I actually think that broke something in Harry. Because suddenly he was out, he was free, he got what he said he wanted, and he couldn't stand it. Some people think he's still waiting for the palace to ask him back. Like he's been waiting all this time for them to realize they made a mistake and want him home again. And that hasn't happened. And now there's this weird situation where Charles might eventually make peace with him at some point, but William's not going to. William's going to make sure that when he's king, there's nothing left for Harry to come back to. No titles, no line of succession, no free ride, no access. William's going to finish what the palace started. The whole privacy argument that Harry and Meghan keep making, that's actually not even based in reality. They act like if they'd stayed in the royal family, their kids would have been photographed constantly and they wouldn't have any normal life. But that's not how it works. There are members of the royal family whose children aren't public figures. There are royals who aren't working royals, whose kids don't get followed by paparazzi. The Sussexes could have had that if they'd actually stayed and not become the absolute spectacle they became, but they made themselves the spectacle. They became the rogue royals, selling stories and secrets and controversies. That was a choice. The real issue is that Harry and Meghan genuinely believed they were going to get the level of media attention and public interest that Princess Diana had. Like, they thought because Harry was Diana's son, they'd automatically command that same obsession. But that's not how it worked then, and it's definitely not how it works now. Diana had that level of interest because of the timing. She married into the monarchy during this weird period where there was still mystery around the royals, but the press was becoming more powerful. Then you had the drama of her marriage falling apart, the future king going through a divorce, all of that happening at the exact moment when media was accelerating and becoming more sensational. That was lightning in a bottle. Harry and Meghan were never going to be treated that way because they were never going to be king and queen. That's it. That's the whole thing. William's going to be king. Catherine's going to be queen. That's where the real interest is. That's where the real power and importance lies. So when Harry and Meghan didn't get that same level of chase from paparazzi and media, they decided it was bias. They decided it was unfair. They decided the media was against them. But it wasn't any of those things. It was just that they weren't that important in the actual line of succession. They weren't going to be running the country. So why would they get the same attention? And I think that's honestly what a lot of their beef has always been about. They wanted to be treated like they mattered as much as William and Catherine. They wanted that same level of fascination and coverage and prominence, and when they didn't get it, they took it personally. Instead of understanding that the interest people had was tied to actual constitutional importance, like this person is going to be king someday. So I care what happens in their life, they convinced themselves it was about personality or bias or the media being unfair, but it was never personal. It was about the line of succession. That was the whole thing. So when they left and tried to build this independent brand, they quickly realized that without the royal title, without the prestige of being actual royals with actual importance, they didn't have the same currency. People cared about them for about 5 seconds because of the drama and the controversy, but it didn't stick. And that's been a huge adjustment for them because they expected that their name and their story would carry them, that they'd become these major celebrities and cultural figures. But it turns out you need more than a famous last name and a controversial exit to maintain that kind of attention long term. You need actual substance. You need to deliver something. And they haven't been able to do that. What's been really telling is watching them constantly blame external circumstances for why things aren't working out. Meghan's been in interviews talking about how a series of unfortunate events kept derailing her plans. First, it was the palace being too controlling. Then it was the media being horrible. Then it was COVID that ruined the timing of everything. Then it was this other thing and that other thing. It's always something external. It's always something that happened to them that kept them from succeeding. But at some point, you have to look at what's actually in your control and what you're actually doing with it. The internet has fundamentally changed how this all works, and Harry and Meghan still seem to be operating in the old paradigm where you could control these narratives, where you could tell a story and have it stick because there wasn't an immediate way to fact check you, where you could separate yourself from scrutiny because access to information was limited. None of that is true anymore. Every interview they do gets scrutinized instantly. Every claim gets checked against what they've said before. Every contradiction gets highlighted and shared and discussed. The world has moved on from the era where this kind of spin actually works. And look, some people think that if Harry and Meghan actually cared about fixing their relationship with the royal family, they'd do the hard work. They'd make public statements correcting the record, they'd apologize for the lies, they'd set the record straight about the exaggerations and the manipulations. But they're not going to do that because it would require admitting that they've been wrong. And Harry and Meghan both seem incapable of that kind of accountability. They're too busy looking backward, too busy blaming things that happened in the past, too busy pointing fingers at the palace or the media or circumstances. They're stuck there. The thing that really bothers people is that neither of them seems willing to just take honest accountability for where they are now and who they are now. Like, fine, maybe the palace wasn't perfect. Maybe there were things that were genuinely difficult about being in that institution. Maybe there were real grievances. But at some point you have to say, okay, that was then, this is now, and I'm responsible for what I do with my life from here on out. You have to let go of it because holding on to it is what's actually keeping you stuck. You're not moving forward because you're constantly looking backward and blaming things that aren't happening anymore. Harry seems particularly trapped in this because he's got all of this unresolved stuff tied to his mother and his childhood and his coming of age in the public eye. And people do give him a lot of grace because of that. Like,